That said, welcome one more time in case you just joined in the last 30 seconds. Thanks for joining Solar United Neighbors tonight for REAP Solar Grants in Your Rural Business. I am going to go ahead and hand it over to our interpreters to let us know how to get Spanish language set up.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias. Good evening. My name is Maria Angelica. My pronouns are she and they. And I will first give these instructions in Spanish and then in English. Mi nombre es María Angélica, mis pronombres son ella y ellos, y hoy proveeremos interpretación en español y en inglés. Primero voy a dar estas instrucciones en español y después en inglés. This webinar tonight disculpen, este seminario web esta noche va a ser presentado en inglés. Si ustedes prefieren escuchar en español, pueden activar la interpretación en el computador tocando el globo abajo que dice interpretación. Ahí eligen el español y eso es todo. Si están conectando desde un teléfono, por favor toquen los 3 puntos abajo a mano derecha que dicen interpretación, que dice más. Eligen interpretación de idiomas. Ahí eligen el español y después arriba a la mano derecha finalizar. Si en algún momento tienen alguna dificultad o pregunta acerca de la interpretación, por favor déjenoslo saber en el chat y con gusto les apoyaremos. Y también vamos a estar poniendo estas instrucciones en el chat. Good evening. My name is Maria Angelica. My pronouns are she and they. And today we will be providing interpretation in Spanish and in English with MARB Language Services to ensure that we can all listen in the language that we prefer. Tonight's webinar will be in English. And if you would prefer to listen to it in Spanish, you may do so activating the interpretation feature. If you're on your computer, you can click on the globe at the bottom of your screen that says interpretation. There you choose English if you prefer English, Spanish if you prefer Spanish, and that is all. If you're joining from a phone, it's a little bit different. You can tap the 3 dots at the bottom of your screen that say more. There you choose language interpretation. You choose Spanish if you prefer Spanish, and at the top right, you tap done. We're also going to paste these instructions in the chat. And if you have any questions or any issues with interpretation, feel free to let us know and we'll be happy to support you. Thank you. Gracias.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate your help getting all of that set up. So Alexis, yep, thank you. You're on the next slide already. I just want to touch on a couple of other logistics before we jump in. If you want to ask a question, we encourage you to do that. We will answer some of them through the Q&A as we go. So please make sure to enter your questions in the Q&A. And we have also set aside some time at the end to go over as many questions as we can live. Then we also have a chat enabled for tonight. I see some of you are already introducing yourselves there. That's wonderful. Please go ahead and do that. The chat is best for conversation with other attendees, and then the Q&A is best for questions. So next slide, I'm going to share a quick preview of what we have in store this evening. My name is Emma Searson. I'm a policy and advocacy campaigner with Solar United Neighbors. I'll be giving a brief presentation about REAP, what that program is and how it can benefit you. I'm then excited to hand it off to Fritz Eppinger, who is a solar project developer with Nokomis Energy and has lots of experience with helping folks write successful grant applications for REAP projects. And then last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from John Kokel, who is the general manager at Renaissance Farms Veterinary Hospital. John received a REAP solar grant and is willing to share a little bit about his experience with us. And then, as I mentioned, we have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, so please do have those questions ready. So without further ado, I want to jump in and start with REAP itself and what this program is all about. Next slide, please. So REAP stands for the Rural Energy for America program. It is a federally funded grant and loan program that helps farmers and rural business owners access renewable energy technologies and also energy efficiency technologies. REAP was established in 2002 as part of the Federal Farm Bill and it's administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or USDA. Throughout its lifetime, REAP has been a very popular program. It's enjoyed very broad bipartisan support all across the country, and that remains true to this day. People love REAP. It does provide both grants and loans, and both of those can be used to fund a wide range of different clean energy technologies. But that said, in tonight's webinar, we are going to focus specifically on REAP grants and REAP grants that fund solar projects. So next slide. Before talking more about the nitty-gritty of REAP, I want to spend just a couple minutes here on the many reasons that any rural small business owner or farmer should be thinking about going solar, and why doing so through a REAP grant is so beneficial. So first, if you go solar, you'll enjoy more energy choice and more energy freedom, because by definition, you're making a choice to actually decide where your energy comes from and to produce that energy yourself. And that is a really powerful and helpful thing to do. Going solar can also really substantially reduce your business's energy costs, and it can help you better predict and control those costs for the long haul. So when you have solar, you're not as dependent on things like oil and gas prices, which, as we have seen, certainly this past year, can really fluctuate over time, and that can threaten your bottom line. On a related note, powering your business with solar and pairing that solar with storage will also give you much more energy security. So that means that your business will be insulated from the risk of things like power outages, which can happen because of extreme weather events. They can happen because of fossil fuel supply chain issues, and you don't want your business to be vulnerable to that sort of interruption. Then this may go without saying, but I'll still say it. Going solar also enables you to tap into this amazingly abundant natural energy resource that doesn't pollute. You know, solar keeps our air and water clean and our climate healthy. And then on top of all of that, solar is also getting more and more affordable. Prices have been dropping over the last decade as this technology has matured. And going solar with a REAP grant will give you the chance to not only take advantage of the affordability of solar technology, but also to shave up to 40% off of the total cost of going solar. So that makes solar for rural businesses and farms so much more affordable than it ever has been. And the last thing I'll note here is that if you do receive a REAP grant, you or your installer can still take advantage of other really helpful incentives, especially the solar federal tax credit for businesses. This is also known as the Section 48 Investment Tax Credit, or ITC, or Business ITC. That program will help you reduce the cost of going solar by another 30% or so. The exact number just depends a little bit on things like timing and whether your installer meets some new standards for labor. But all in all, it can help you save a lot of money. So I also want to talk about a few things that have changed with the REAP program since the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA for short. So I mentioned that REAP is really popular. And one thing that's meant is that REAP solar grants have always been in really high demand. Historically, it's actually been such a popular program that its budget, which is set each year through the Farm Bill, was truly nowhere near big enough to fund every project, every good project that applied for a grant. But thanks to the passage of the IRA this last year, if folks were following that, the program is now seeing a really unprecedented level of investment. So there is just a lot more REAP funding to go around this year and for future years. So specifically, the IRA quadrupled funding for REAP over the next 10 years. And it also lifted the cap that limits how large an individual grant for a single project can be. So that cap used to be set at 25% of a project's total cost. And now that cap is actually up to 40% of a project's total cost. And one important side note is that that applies for the deadline that just passed, which is October 31st of last year. And it also applies for the deadline that's coming up next, which is the end of March this year. At some point down the line, we are expecting additional guidance from the USDA's Office of Rural Development, which will describe how some projects may be able to get up to 50% of their total costs covered by REAP, which is the new maximum defined by law in the IRA. But we don't have that guidance yet, and we know that 40% is the maximum you can get in this upcoming March cycle. So with that said, the number one takeaway from my presentation and maybe even from the webinar as a whole is that a REAP grant can help you power your farm or your rural business with solar and do so affordably. Because there's so much more funding to go around than there ever has been, and because you can win a much larger grant than you could have in years past, this is really a historic opportunity for farmers and for rural small business owners to take advantage of this program. So I will stop there and hand it off to Fritz, who is going to tell us a little bit more about how to actually apply for the REAP program. So Fritz, you can take it away.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, happy Groundhog's Day. It's 2 below zero in Minnesota, so I know there are a few Minnesotans that are suffering with me, but so it goes. I'm Fritz Ebinger. Just to give you a background, I worked for the University of Minnesota Extension for about 7 years and change, specifically with farmers and rural businesses on this grant program and also some other research and development programs. I left that role not too long ago, and I still play in the solar sandbox, so to speak. But I'm going to detail for you how to apply for a REAP solar grant. So let's roll right into it, and can I have the next slide, please? So Solar United Neighbors is about to issue or has issued a really nice guide about how to apply for a REAP grant. I believe that if you know how to fill out any kind of quasi interesting form, you can fill out a REAP grant. The guide talks through who's eligible for REAP grants, what you need to know to apply for REAP grants, and how to make your application successful. There's some pretty interesting key points that are highlighted in the guide that should help people get across the finish line. Next slide, please. So today we are focusing on Holstein cows. Okay, we are focusing on REAP grants, specifically for solar projects, for projects that are in the small tier size, which is $80,000 or under. Next slide. So for eligibility, there are two groups that are eligible for REAP grants. There are farmers, meaning that you get at least 50% or more of your gross income from agricultural production. So they distinguish people that might do field work with implementation, with farm implements that they rent out, compared to people that actually raise crops and livestock. If you're wondering whether you're a farmer, you want to look at Schedule F of your tax form, which is the profit or loss from farming. And essentially what they're trying to do is screen out hobby farmers. The other major category that we're going to focus on are rural small businesses. And that covers a lot more folks. Generally, if you are outside of an area with 50,000 people or less, if you're inside, how do I describe this? If you live in a town that does not have at least 50,000 people in it, you should qualify for the REAP grant as a small business. Oftentimes, people wonder whether they're a farmer or a rural small business. Generally, you fit into one category if you're wondering. Typically, probably the classic example is if you hear about an apple farmer who also rents out their barn for weddings and events or something like that. You should be able to qualify under one of those categories. Next slide, please. The application is scored out of 100 points. The guide walks you through each category step by step. It includes how to estimate your project score. As Emma referenced earlier, there are two deadlines. There's an October 31st deadline that had just passed and the March 31st deadline that is coming up. The October 31st deadline historically has always covered the small tier projects. And that's where the majority of the grant money is issued to farmers and rural small businesses. The logic there is that the USDA Office of Rural Development would rather spread a lot of grant money over many projects rather than just a few larger projects. There's still funding for the March 31st deadline. I am of the opinion that if you don't shoot, you can't score. And I think it would behoove everybody to take a hard look at the grant and take the time to put the application in. I wanted to mention a couple things about the actual point scoring. In particular, there are priority points if you are a historically disadvantaged farmer or a veteran or several other categories that are listed in the actual grant application. I want to draw your attention. This presidential administration is focusing on areas of the country that are historically, where the country has not seen much financial investment. So that the administration is making an effort to issue grant monies in those specific census blocks. Next slide, please. Okay. Major point here is you want to submit your REAP application before you build your project. The REAP grant does not work in reverse. You cannot build your project and then apply for a REAP grant. You can submit your application, get notice from the Office of Rural Development for your state that your application is complete, and then build your project, not knowing whether you've actually had the grant, whether you've been awarded the grant, but it does not work in reverse. The other major point that I'd want to make is make sure that the project economics are not driven by the grant, meaning that you can afford the project whether or not the grant will end up in your hands at the end of the day. I have heard of some horror stories where people assume that they were going to win a REAP grant. They took out loans, and then the REAP grant happened to be particularly competitive that year, and they didn't win any grant money. And then they're stuck with a large loan that they had to pay off over time. So make sure you think through your project economics before you start building anything. But I will say there's a lot more money in the REAP grant program. And again, you can't score if you don't shoot. Next slide, please. First thing you want to do is get together your paperwork. You're going to need 3 years of tax returns. You'll need your employee payroll for small businesses. You will need electric bills for the last 12 months, which helps substantiate the rates that you are putting into the grant application as far as electricity goes. You will need a project quote from an installer. You will need financial documentation of committed funds, which means you have to be able to show you either have cash on hand to afford the project or some kind of loan that will help you afford the project. And that's to help the USDA understand whether this project is realistic or not. You also want to have a federal unique entity ID, which you will get from the System for Award Management, which is www.sam.gov. That's probably one of the earlier things you want to start on with the application. Effectively, what it is a unique code specific to your project that tracks with your REAP grant application as it goes through the system. Next slide, please. All right, alphabet soup. Application forms. So the main component of the application is form RD 4280-3A. That 4280 comes from the Code of Federal Regulations that writes out the REAP grant. The easiest way to access these forms before I describe them is to go to your local USDA Office of Rural Development or the USDA Office of Rural Development website and locate the REAP grant page. It should have all the forms there. You can also call your local USDA office, specifically the rural development representative for your area, and ask that individual directly for those forms. They are available in electronic format. You can download them as PDFs. Make sure you download them as PDFs and then open them up and it's apart from your browser so you can actually save your work. Form SF 424 stands for Standard Form 424, which is anytime anybody, no matter what the program, is requesting federal assistance. It's a basic download of your information, your business information. where you live, who your federal representative is, and so forth. Form SF 424C is the budget form, which needs to match for the most part what you're putting on your REAP grant application. SF 424D is a construction form, which is actually very straightforward. Basically, check a couple of boxes and you're good to go. And then the last form, RD 1940-20, is an environmental form that is also mostly checking boxes and signing your name at the bottom. So all those forms have to go in with the grant application. I don't want folks to feel intimidated because they actually are very straightforward. Next slide, please. All right. So go to rd.usda.gov and then find your state. Click on your state office page. If you're in Minnesota, I know that person quite well. And then I would encourage you to, at a minimum, reach out to the USDA Office of Rural Development for your state, just to have a conversation with them to get a sense of what they're hearing, how many applications they're anticipating, just a general sense of things that might be going on in that specific office. Like I said, you can download the forms from the Rural Development website, but it's always good to have a good conversation on the early end with your Rural Development office. Next slide, please. So getting back to the step-by-step instructions and the SUN guide, we really do take you block by block through this grant application in as simple terms as possible. One of the things that I like about how they design this guide is that they highlight the points tips in these boxes to really get across the point of that specific information that the USDA is asking. The one that you have right here is actually highlights the priority points that the USDA Office of Rural Development is looking at in terms of being owned by a veteran, a socially disadvantaged group, whether the Secretary of Agriculture has a specific technology they want to see and so forth. So anyway, it's a great guide. It's available through the SUN website, of course, and I certainly encourage you to take a hard look at it. Next slide, please. So after you submit, you want to make sure that you get an application and complete response, either by email or by letter. Effectively, that's the USDA Rural Development Office thumbs up, if there's an emoji. Just a reminder that once you build, you cannot reapply for the grant. At least you cannot reapply for the business entity that you applied with the first go around. It's really hard to dip out of that same pot twice. I'll say that. USDA's Office of Rural Development will contact successful applicants down the road. I would typically say the wait is maybe 6 weeks after the deadline until you'll hear one way or the other. Next slide, please. Okay. Can I say a couple of things? The one thing I wanted to make sure people do is they contact their rural electric cooperative or they contact their local utility on the front end just to walk through the technical aspects of the solar project. Just so there are no surprises and everybody knows exactly what's going on, what to expect. That's a pretty critical piece because the USDA is one component, but you're also plugging into the grid, which is another component. You want to make sure that there's alignment between those two conversations. So I'll leave it at that for the Q&A, and I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fritz. So helpful. Got lots of great questions coming into the Q&A. So hope you're ready and warmed up to head to those at the end. But before we do that, we are going to hear from John, who, as I mentioned, has applied for REAP and won a REAP Solar grant. So we're excited to hear a little bit about his story. You can take it away, John.
Well, good evening, everybody. My name is John Kokel, and I am the general manager of Renaissance Farms. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our Key Largo solar project. If you could go ahead and cue up the presentation. Thank you. Next slide. So the system is just about 31 kilowatts. It's 96 panels. They're LGs. Our inverter equipment and optimizers are Solar Edge. And we are grid tied to the Florida Keys Electrical Cooperative. So we do not have battery backup. We do store on the grid, and they're a wonderful organization to work with, and they basically store our power for free. Next slide. So here's just a quick look at the building. We're an ideal location for solar, and we pretty much packed the roof as full as we could with just enough extra room for maintenance. Next slide. So the building itself is a little under 4,000 square feet. Last year, we used a little bit more than 45 megawatts of power. We find year to year that, you know, depending on the weather, we are able to produce 80 to 90% of the total needs of the veterinary practice in the building. The practice uses 17 workstations and monitors. Their servers run 24/7, and there's a whole array of refrigerators and freezers and washer and dryers. And as you can imagine, just quite a bit of equipment that goes into doing all of that. You know, there's 14 tons of air conditioning in the building that pretty much runs in the Florida Keys year round. A little lighter in the winter months, but with all the activity and people, it's pretty much running all the time. While we're on this slide, it is fair to say that the building was remodeled in 2010, and the performance metrics I talk about were achieved because we were very energy conscious when we remodeled the building. So things like insulation and LED lighting and Energy Star appliances were a big part of the product mix here of trying to put together a really good energy consumption strategy to go along with our energy production strategy. Next slide. So this came right off the SolarEdge web portal for this site right here. And if you look at the lifetime energy, this, I'll tell you what, if you look down at the lower left or right-hand side, you're going to see this was installed on 12/14 of 2015, which is basically when it went live. You know, so since then we've produced a little over 302 megawatts of power. That lifetime revenue number, I'd like you to kind of ignore that. I highlighted it because I want you to ignore it, because energy prices fluctuate, and that's maybe better. I don't even think that's an accurate guess. But what is quite accurate is our system production metrics, and I'm showing you 2022 here, and you know, you can kind of see the kind of the weather patterns. April and May, at least down here in Southern Florida, are far and away our most productive power generation months, just because of the weather's a little cooler and the panels are a little cooler. Next slide. So this kind of gives you a little bit of a look at the variability year over year. If you look like in September of 20, well, you can find Hurricane Irma on there if you look hard enough. But anyway, it kind of gives you an idea of some of the variability in weather and what your production matrix could be expected, but it's pretty consistent. Next slide. So here's the fun part. You know, when I started looking at all of this and I found out about the REAP grant, I started investigating it. And when I realized what the numbers looked like, it was just too compelling to ignore. So on a total system cost with installation, excuse me, it's important to point out here that these are 2015 dollars and these are 2015 tax laws. So I'm not current on pricing on products, and I haven't been following the tax laws that closely either. So when you look at this modeling, just please keep that in mind. But on a system cost of $94,600, our 25% REAP grants was $23,650. We were also able to take advantage of the investment tax credit, which was 30% then. And then we also utilized Section 179 depreciation. And at a 28% tax rate for this property, you know, it yielded $20,528. So our total incentives on this, thanks to Uncle Sam, were a little bit north of $65,000, which brought the system cost down to $29,000, which made the payback pretty compelling. So our annual power cost savings on average, based on weather, was $6,400 a year, which paid for the system in 4.5 years. And it's important to note too that, and I think it's not just the vendors I chose for equipment, but it's also industry standards, that most of the equipment that I'm talking about is warranted for 25 years for performance. I know the LG panels are warranted for no more than a 7% degradation in year 25. So you're looking at a system here that you can count on reliability and performance for a pretty extended period of time. And that makes your long-term payback even more compelling. You're basically fixing your energy costs for 25 years or more. In my particular case, I spent a little bit of extra money, which is also included in the system costs. And I bought an additional 12-year warranty on the inverters and the optimizers. Next slide. So, it's funny, I don't want to just read the slides here. Let me just tell you that the folks I worked with in Florida were just wonderful. They were incredibly responsive. They were very timely. They bent over backwards to provide whatever information was needed. They provided all kinds of insights, and they basically just handheld me through the whole process. So I'm incredibly thankful to them. They were very dedicated and professional people, and I was the recipient of their professionalism, and I just did not want to make this presentation without acknowledging that. Next slide. So, I think Emma covered most of this already, but from my standpoint, this all goes to the bottom line. If you can reduce your energy costs, why not? And if you can fix them or basically get free energy for more than 25 years, that's a very compelling thing. We've witnessed what's happened in the last year and a half with the war in Ukraine and the volatility in natural gas prices, which in many cases are tolled through power plants to generate power. So energy costs long-term are kind of a wild card, and this is a way you can actually take that variable out of the equation. And then you can do the right thing to help Mother Earth. And the process, Fritz did a really nice job of outlining it, but it's really not that difficult. It's pretty straightforward and easy to do. Next slide.
All right. Thank you so much, John, for sharing your experience. And those are some very compelling savings. I don't know about you all, but that makes me feel inspired. So we are going to open it up for questions at this point. I am going to start with some that are already in the Q&A. And just a reminder, it's not too late. If you have a question, please go ahead and add it to that Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to it here in the next 25 minutes or so. So one that I see in here, and Fritz, I think you spoke to this briefly in your presentation, but it might be helpful to spend another minute on it because it's one I hear a lot, is from Josh, and it's how long is the typical timeline from REAP application to release of funds? And if that is a long period of time, how can clients or applicants kind of plan for that?
That's a difficult question to answer.
I'm sorry.
generally, it's about 6 weeks, I would say, probably from the time that an application is successfully submitted, the deadline passes, the USDA has time to go through all the grant applications and score them, and then turn around and give notice to the successful applicants. I'd say it's roughly 6 months. Sometimes politics can get in the way. I remember there was some federal funding issues that made it difficult for the USDA to be able to say certain things about whether a grant got money or not. That's happened in the past, but I think for the most part that has been resolved because the funding for this program has been set for the long term through the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yes. Yeah. Thank goodness. Great. Thank you. That's helpful. So the next question I see and want to get to is in Spanish. So I'm going to place it in the chat. And if one of our interpreters would be willing to come off mute and read it aloud for everyone so we all can understand it in both languages, that would be great. Oh, okay, I see. We have it in the chat. Do you
Thank
want
you.
to? Okay, great. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, the question reads, is the support only for businesses or is it also for homeowners?
Yes, thank you. I thought that might be what this said. Wanted to make sure to answer this one because it is a really common one. The REAP program is available to two groups of people, farmers and rural small business owners. So that means it's not a grant program that's available to help you put solar on your home. Fritz, do you want to add anything to that? Any more specifics?
Yep, it's pretty much what you said. It's not designed for homeowners. There are other programs that your utility might offer, or other ways that you might want to do that. But the Office of Rural Development is targeting rural small businesses and farms specifically for helping build out those economies and facilitate employment and economic growth. So it's not, the USDA is not going to fund your personal home, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yeah, don't we wish? Thank you. Great. Well, I see a question from Greg that is a good one. Greg asked, I have heard that the maximum level of the REAP grant will increase to 50% in the fall. Is that correct? I can take this one. You are correct that the legally defined maximum for REAP solar grants since the Inflation Reduction Act passed last year is set at 50%. But the reason I said legally defined is because that's currently not what's available. 40% is what we know is available for this upcoming grant cycle. So we are expecting at some point to get clarification from USDA on how certain projects will be able to qualify for that extra 10 that would get them to 50%. But we're not sure which projects are going to meet those qualifications, and it's not going to be everyone, or at least we don't expect it to be everyone. We expect it to be some subset of applications that might be able to qualify for that extra bump. And then I think there was a kind of related question. I'm going to see if I can find it real quick about how the REAP program overlaps with the Justice 40 initiative. Yeah, here it is. That was asked by Ash. If folks aren't familiar, the Justice 40 initiative or goal is a initiative of the administration to spend or to dedicate 40% of government resources towards programs that are specifically, geared towards improving justice and access to things like renewable energy, but certainly not only. The reason I think these are a little bit related is my hunch is that in order to get that extra bit and get up to a 50% cost share from the REAP program is that it's very likely that some of the qualifications for that will be thinking more about ways to make the REAP program as just and equitable as possible. So who's to say? We'll still have to sit tight for those clarifications, but that's one way that the two programs could overlap. And then, Fritz, I might send it back to you. You mentioned at some point that there are some bonus points, right, in the application for applicants who are disadvantaged or might also kind of meet some of the goals of those Justice 40 initiatives.
Yeah, they are called priority points. I'm drawing a blank on whether it's 10 points or 15 points, but I think the phrase is historically disadvantaged, which would include racial minorities, women, I recall, tribal members, trying to blank on the other ones. And then it also includes underrepresented technologies that may not see conventional funding.
Sure.
And then, like Emma said, the Justice 40 initiative is actually focused on sending federal dollars to census blocks that are federally impoverished areas. So they're targeting dollars for economic growth to fund projects there. And it's been a while since I've looked at that actual piece of the application, but it is in guideline. And there are ways that if you are a veteran or you're a tribal member, or a tribal owned business, you can designate that on the application.
Great, thank you. it looks like Bobby, my colleague Bobby has put a little bit more info about those definitions in the chat, so folks can look to that too. I saw this question come into the chat just recently, and because it's right in front of me, it looks like a good one, so I'll go ahead and read it out. Brad asked, mentioned that the case study shared from Key Largo, so that was John's case study, was a veterinary practice. He's wondering if another veterinary practice elsewhere would be able to qualify if it's not linked to agriculture. So if it's not large animal or otherwise. So I would say, and Fritz can correct me if I say anything wrong, that, if it is a small business, if it meets those standards for being a small business and it's located in somewhere or in an area that the USDA designates as rural, yes, those small businesses don't have to be linked to agriculture or bee farms or anything like that in order to qualify. And that's a question I get a lot is, do small businesses need to also be agriculturally linked?
Yeah. If I can tack on, there's an actual map.
Oh, yes. Thank you for mentioning that.
I don't recall if I mentioned that. There's a rural eligibility map through the USDA that will tell you whether you are in a rural area per the USDA. And then the other, even if you're not in one of those areas that says you're rural, you can also apply through your state office that your business is rural in character, which I have seen. There's some areas that are clearly on farmland, but for whatever reason, there's a subdivision maybe a quarter mile away that loops you into the metro area, so to speak. But there's a way, if you're a rural in character, you can also apply. The map is easier.
Awesome. Yes, it is definitely easier. Thank you. Okay, I'm looking back into the Q&A here. Lots of great questions. It's always a tough thing to decide what to get to next. Oh, this is a fun one. We're all working from home these days, or lots of us are, after, COVID. I think a lot of those practices stuck. They certainly did for me. So Jeff asked, and maybe someone else did too, are home-based businesses or, folks who might be working from home, would those folks potentially be eligible for REAP? I don't know the answer to that. Fritz, do you?
Yeah, the answer is it depends.
Okay, great.
So what I mean by that is, it's not, the USDA is not going to put solar on your personal residence, but if you have, for example, maybe a large warehouse or something like that, where you operate your business, there's a possibility that you could put it on there. You would have to put a second meter, a business specific meter on that building and meter that energy separately, because the policy is that USDA Rural Development doesn't want to fund your project that's going to offset your personal consumption. But if it's a business venture, they will, and they're simply going to make sure that it's metered appropriately. I mean, many rural businesses or maybe farmsteads or homesteads have a little bit of a combination where the farm might be on the same meter as the house. In those instances, the application discounts the personal consumption from the farm consumption, and that's how they arrive at the answer. Like, it's basically a prorated score when it comes to the REAP grant application. So.
Great. That is very helpful. And then I apologize, I have a follow-up question to this one. We've also gotten the question from a few folks of whether the business has to have employees in order to count as a small business. Looks like a no. Nope. Great. All right. Simple enough. Awesome. Okay, and then here's a good one as well in the chat from Ryan. Ryan asked, would the grant for up to 40% REAP grants apply to projects that incorporate solar, or is it limited to solar energy projects only? And the example he gave of a project that might incorporate solar is an EV station that's partially powered by solar and battery backup. I don't know about that specific example, but REAP grants certainly can be used for technologies other than solar. We just chose to focus in on solar for this conversation and for our application guide, since that is Solar United Neighbors focus and for the purpose of simplicity. But there are other technologies out there. Fritz, do you know if REAP grants can be used for EVs? Is that on the list?
I don't think they can be used for EVs themselves. Generally, the rural development doesn't fund things like skid loaders and EVs and so forth.
Sure.
The question whether it will fund something like an EV charging station as a standalone business is a little bit different. Generally, you want to be in business for at least a year. And the USDA is looking probably for a piece of property that business either owns or has a long-term lease with, where the USDA can rely on this long-term lease, that the money that the federal government is spending on that project is actually going to provide that tangible benefit. It's about as much as I can outline without knowing more specifics about that project.
Sure. Yeah. Understood. No, I think a lot of these questions are unfortunately pretty project specific. So we're doing our best to answer the ones that probably apply to multiple people, and appreciate everyone's understanding of that. Let's see. I've gotten this question a couple of times as well, whether somebody who has a pretty new business doesn't have those 3 years of tax returns is going to potentially be able to apply for the REAP program. I think I remember seeing this in our guide, actually, that there is a workaround. There's a way to apply if you don't have all of that documentation. Is that right, Fritz?
That's right. It doesn't say you can't apply if you haven't been in business for a year, but you're going to have at least some business filing. I think what the USDA is looking for is that the business is a going concern, and it wasn't just created to try and apply for a REAP grant to fund something. So, I mean, that's how I approach it. I would say, again, like for really specific questions, you're going to want to contact the program director for your rural development office in your state and have that explicit conversation. Those are the folks that are going to know the REAP grant even better than I know. So.
Yeah, absolutely. No, definitely a good thing to reiterate how helpful those folks are. I know that's something John talked about too. And one question I want to throw out, which actually may be best for you to answer, John, if you are able, is if you could just speak a little bit more. You mentioned how helpful those outreach specialists were in Florida to you. If you could just share a little bit more about like what sort of questions they were able to help you answer, if any, whether you're, how long that timeline was for you. Fritz mentioned it can be about 6 weeks for other people, but does that all coincide with your experience?
Well, it's 7 years ago. I'll do the best I can to recall. I could just brag all evening about how wonderful the people were at the state of Florida office for REAP, the USDA. Just incredibly responsive. They just made it easy. And without any disrespect intended, I'm typically, when you work with government agencies, you don't see that kind of dedicated customer service, so to speak. Every step of the whole program, they were there, they were responsive, they answered questions. They got me all the data I needed. They helped shuffle the paperwork around. If I was deficient in one area, they let me know about it right away and let me know what I needed to do to remedy it. So I just got nothing but just high marks for the way they assisted with the program. What was the other question, Emma? You asked me.
I was wondering about your experience of the timeline, like how quickly you were able to work through the application process, and then how quickly you were able to hear back about your grant.
I'll bet I didn't have more than 3 or 5 hours in the application.
Nice.
If even that.
Yeah.
And then once again, I don't know what's changed from 2015 to now, but it wasn't a whole lot. When you're running a business, a lot of this information is readily available to you. I think the qualification part was probably the most difficult. Well, no, excuse me, scoping the project. And I've noticed some of the questions, about having the money up front and how do we fund this and so on and so forth. Yeah, you really need to figure out how much power you want to generate, what you can qualify for, what it's going to cost. I don't know, Fritz, if you have your folks go out to PV Watts, the Department of Energy's website, and that's a good way where you can actually, it's a remarkable tool. I've used it on 2 solar projects, and it's remarkably accurate. So you can kind of project a build, so to speak. You can figure out how much power you want to generate how many panels and how much equipment it's going to take to generate that power, and then you can go out and start getting some costs, and then now you've got the basics for the grant. I actually think that's probably the hardest part about all of this, is just scoping out that aspect of the project. Once you've got that done, applying for the grant and going through the paperwork is not that difficult.
Mhm.
Fritz, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, PV Watts is a great tool. You want to make sure you know how to use it. It's probably the best thing, but I think most folks can play around with it enough to understand how it works and how to apply it. And they can, it's through the National Renewable Energy Lab. Pretty much if you Google NREL PV Watts, it should pop up for you. What it does is it gives you a mapping function, like John said, and you basically sketch out your project to get a pretty good ballpark of what the kilowatt size it's going to be, and what the energy production you could expect is. I use that a lot. I'm a trained site assessor as well. And oftentimes your solar installer should be able to give you a similar energy output estimate. And oftentimes you can, my recommendation, just like picking out like a plumber or something to remodel your bathroom, you want to get 2 or 3 quotes that you can compare across each other, so you understand who's asking for what from you, who's got the right energy estimate. So it's going to give you a pretty good idea what it is. So,
Emma, if I may interject too, I neglected to say this. This really starts with your consumption. You need to take a look at your business and how much power you're consuming. And that's where then you'll start to determine how to size your system, which will ultimately determine your costs.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point.
I would be remiss, I have to say this, I would be remiss if I didn't say the USDA REAP fund also funds energy efficiency projects.
Sure does.
So that's like John said, that's where you want to start. But I was specifically asked to talk about solar in this one.
Well, that's all right. We have nothing against efficiency here, so that's acceptable plug. I have one question I found. It was a helpful pause for me to dig through the Q&A a little bit. And I've gotten this one via email from a few folks before as well, which is, what about nonprofit farms? That's a structure that exists. There's certainly some of those out there. I reached out to the California, which is where I live, energy coordinator for the Office of Rural Development, and it sounds like that's not a category that unfortunately is eligible for REAP. That the farmer category does need to be like for-profit entities. Fritz, is there anything you want to add to that? Answer that.
Not much. I mean, there are certain kind of complicated ways that a for-profit entity that is owned by a nonprofit could receive REAP funds. In the instance that, say the for-profit business is providing the revenue for the nonprofit, but you would be applying under the limited liability company or that for-profit business to make that work.
Got it. Okay.
It's pretty complicated. People get ideas about creating an entity for their nonprofit for the purpose of applying for a REAP grant, and that's a little bit too much house of cards for me. So it's think it through a little bit, I'd say.
Sure. Okay. Fair enough. And then a question from Randy. Randy asked if you can apply for a grant to add stationary storage to an existing solar system. I would broaden this. Generally, can you use REAP grants for storage? I get questions related to that a fair amount of the time. I did also hear from the California Office of Rural Development that a REAP grant can go towards a solar project that has a storage component. I didn't ask the specific question. Fritz, do you happen to know off the top of your head? It's okay if you don't.
I don't. I do know they will cover them, and I can't remember what the percentages. I think it's in relation to how much energy storage there is relevant to the actual energy production. And I vaguely recall there's some kind of pro rata formula to it.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Great. And then someone asked how much time you have to actually complete your solar project, actually get it built and connected once the award is confirmed. Is that a question you know the answer to, Fritz? And there may not be a limit. I haven't heard one.
I want to say like a 2-year clawback, maybe.
Oh, okay, yeah,
Um,
so you've got plenty of time.
Yeah, I'd be surprised why you wouldn't build it. I wouldn't now. There's some supply chain issues that are still out there.
Sure.
But I want to say it's 2 years. Please don't quote me on that though.
Okay, all right, we have a maybe 2 years answer. Great. Yeah, John, you've got your hand up. Go ahead, jump right in.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in. When I did my project, I had to do an attestation for production for 3 years. So they do follow up to make sure that you do what you committed to do, and the system is performing as you told the USDA it would perform. So there is accountability. It's not like you get the money and then walk away and say, see you later. They do follow up, and you do have to submit some. The paperwork you submit is very, very little. I think it's a 1-page document, but you're just basically telling them that everything is working the way you agreed to make it work.
I wanted to tack onto that. I think the limiting factor in that situation is going to be your building permit from your local jurisdiction, not the USDA.
Right.
Typically, a building permit has about a 1-year time span where you have to build a project or resubmit your paperwork again. So
Sure. All good to keep in mind. Well, I am looking at the clock. I know that there are dozens of questions we haven't gotten to, and I apologize for that, but we need to wrap up here in just a couple of minutes. And I want to make sure to be able to touch on just a couple of things to know for follow-up after tonight. Alexis, if you could switch to the next slide. The first thing I want to make sure you all have is the link to tonight's to the guide, the application guide for the REAP program that we were really talking through tonight. So that's the first link on the screen, solarunitedneighbors.org/REAP. I know it's also been in the chat at least once, and we will also email that out. So don't worry if you can't scribble it down quickly enough. One note about that is that guide is currently only available in English. If you head to that link, it will be to an English version of the guide, but we are finishing up a Spanish version as we speak. We'll be able to post that on our website as well in the near future. We will also be sending out this recording after the fact. You can share it, rewatch it. You can share it with folks who weren't able to make it. And then you are also more than welcome to contact us, especially if you've got questions that we couldn't get to tonight. Please don't hesitate to reach out. The best address to use is advocacy@solarunitedneighbors.org. Myself, a few other Sun colleagues will be able to get to your questions there. So please do keep in touch. Thank you again for spending an hour of your evening with Solar United Neighbors to talk about REAP. We're so glad to have you. And thank you again to our guest speakers, John and Fritz. We will go ahead and wrap up there. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.